Hey guys, tonight we slip into the warm, dusty hush of an ancient room where wet clay sits on a wooden board and you can almost smell river mud drying in the heat. You watch a reed stylus press tiny wedges into the surface, click by soft click, like a metronome for a city that refuses to sleep. We are exploring 10 ancient secrets hidden in Sumerian tablets, but we're doing it the safe, sensible way. Some parts are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm, what if imagination. The tablets might preserve everyday reality, they may preserve ideology, and they could preserve stories that grew in the telling. And yes, you probably will not survive this, not because it's scary, but because you would absolutely complain about the heat, the paperwork, and the fact that your dinner is basically barley with ambition. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment with your location and your local time. I love picturing this story drifting into bedrooms and living rooms all over the map. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a place that most historians agree is among the earliest true city landscapes on Earth, the wide, flat world of southern Mesopotamia, where the rivers decide the shape of life. The air feels like warm cloth. The ground is a fine powder of sun, baked dust that clings to your ankles. You blink and see a city rising out of mud brick and reeds, not in a romantic way, but in the practical way that happens when enough people need storage walls, bread, and rules. Archaeology suggests that by the late 4th millennium BCE, places like Uruk are busy with organized labor, temple complexes, and specialists who do things all day long that you would not volunteer for. You can imagine the noise if you let yourself, but tonight you keep it soft. Distant footsteps, a low murmur, the scrape of baskets, the occasional stubborn donkey expressing an opinion. The evidence we do have points to something very grounded. People are tracking goods, tracking work, tracking promises. Civilization begins in part as a shared commitment to remembering who owes what. You move toward a scribal space, a cool corner where the sun doesn't slam down as hard. A scribe sits with a board on his lap, reed stylus in hand. You watch him press wedge marks with the patience of someone who knows that a single wrong stroke can turn 10 jars into 10 disasters. And there it is, your first quiet secret, not a supernatural one, but a real one, hiding in plain sight. What's broadly accepted is that many early tablets are not myths at all. They're receipts, inventories, ration lists, labor assignments, and temple accounts. That might not sound thrilling, but it's the kind of thrilling that built the world you live in. The secret is that the oldest writing we can read is often about administration, not love poems, not heroic speeches, paperwork, the kind of content that would make a modern accountant tear up with pride. One interpretation is that when you see the gods mentioned in these contexts, you may not be seeing lightning bolts and cosmic drama. You may be seeing the sacred language of an economy where a temple is both religious center and warehouse, and the god received is also the institution received. A careful reading might suggest that divine names operate like official letterhead. To be clear, this is debated. Some texts are clearly devotional, some are clearly practical, and some sit in that murky middle where belief and bureaucracy hold hands. You lean closer and imagine the clay still damp, the marks still fresh enough to glisten. What if the first secret isn't a hidden message at all, but a hidden mindset? the idea that reality can be pressed into symbols and carried forward in time. You can feel how bold that is. You can also feel how annoying it would be if someone misspelled your name for eternity. Imagine being immortalized as Dave, but with extra wedges. Tragic. Most historians agree that cuneiform develops over time from earlier counting tokens and pictographic signs into a more flexible system. Archaeology suggests a long evolution, rather than a sudden invention, by a single genius having a dramatic aha moment under a full moon. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, but here it isn't thin. We have a lot of tablets, and their gradual changes are visible. You can practically watch the system learn how to speak, and that brings you to the mood of the night. We are not hunting a single hidden truth. We're walking through a landscape where knowledge is layered. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You're allowed to enjoy the mist. Just don't build your house on it. The room smells like wet earth and smoke from a nearby hearth. You notice a basket of clay lumps, each one ready to become a tablet. It's almost funny in a sleepy way how small the medium is. This is not a grand marble monument. This is pocket-sized history. The sort of thing you could drop, step on, and then spend the next hour pretending you meant to do that. And yet these little slabs carry lists of sheep jars of beer and rations of grain that once fed real people with sore backs and sunburned necks. Historians still argue whether the earliest writing emerges primarily from temple administration or from broader commercial needs, because both spheres overlap in messy human ways. The evidence we do have points to institutions that are hard to separate: temple, palace, workshop, market. It's possible that writing blooms wherever trust needs reinforcement, wherever memory needs a spine. You can almost hear it in the quiet rhythm of the stylus record, like a heartbeat made of wedges. Now you begin to see why the phrase secrets hidden in tablets can be both dramatic and misleading. The mainstream view is not that scribes are hiding alien messages in clay. The mainstream view is that the secrets are often the unintended ones, the patterns you notice when you read thousands of mundane lines. How much barley a worker gets, which jobs are valued, how women appear in lists, which cities claim influence, where shortages show up. The secret is the shape of life. But of course, you're here for a little mist too, and we can do that responsibly. A fringe idea proposes that some tablet traditions preserve memories of events far older than their written forms, like echoes carried forward and finally pressed into clay. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it does remind you of something true in a softer sense. Oral stories can travel a long time before they get pinned down. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask gentle questions without pretending we've solved anything. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not aliens necessarily, but a human instinct to encode meaning in layers. A receipt is a receipt, yes, but it is also a snapshot of power. A list is a list, yes, but it is also a map of relationships. And when you slide into later texts, a hymn is a hymn, yes, but it may also contain historical memories wrapped in metaphor. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The tablets might not be intentionally hiding secrets the way a spy hides a message. The hidden part may simply be what no one intended to spotlight, the background details that become visible only after centuries of study. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it's a calm one, and you can rest in it. You step back and notice the little tool that makes all of this possible, the reed stylus. It's simple, it's ordinary, it's the kind of thing you could lose behind a couch. and yet it turns wet clay into a time capsule. You imagine running your thumb along the grooves, feeling the ridges like tiny stairs. The sound is still with you. Tap, press, lift. Tap, press, lift. It's almost soothing, like someone gently typing in the next room, except the next room is 5,000 years away. Tonight you keep that stylus as your motif, your small object to return to when the mist thickens. You're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. Some clues are receipts, some are prayers, some are rumors, and some are the quiet questions that rise when you realize that the oldest writing we have is not trying to impress you. It's trying to keep the city running. And if you're honest, that might be the most fascinating secret of all the ancient world is not a museum display. It is a workplace. And you sleepy traveler have just wandered into the earliest office on earth, where the gods have titles, the barley has numbers, and your name, if you're not careful, will be misspelled forever in wet clay. You keep moving as if you never really stopped, as if the fan hum in your room is the same warm wind that slides through a city street lined with mud brick walls. The reed stylus stays in your mind like a tiny conductor's baton, tapping time, keeping the night steady. Somewhere nearby, a scribe smooths a fresh tablet, and you realize the clay is not just a surface. It's an attitude. It says write it down because memory is fragile and people. Most historians agree that the Sumerians and their neighbors loved lists with an intensity that feels almost modern. Not the fun kind of list either, like best snacks or movies to watch when you're sad. More like how many sheep are in pen 3 and who delivered 10 baskets but only got paid for 9. Archaeology suggests that early urban life created a need for constant record keeping, land boundaries, grain allocations, temple offerings, labor rosters. The evidence we do have points to an organized society trying to stay organized, which is a little like watching a cat try to fold laundry. And then you meet the second secret, the one that hides behind city lists and king lists and suspicious timelines. It's not that the ancients didn't know what year it was. It's that time itself could be arranged, narrated, and massaged into shape. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamia produced king lists, chronicles, and city accounts that attempt to map political memory into a single storyline. One of the most famous is the Sumerian king list, a text tradition that names rulers and assigns lengths of reign. The mainstream view is that it blends mythic elements, symbolic numbers, and historical rulers into a single framework. Some kings are likely real. Some reign lengths are wildly exaggerated, probably for ideological reasons. The evidence we do have points to a document that's part history and part political statement. One interpretation is that the secret hidden in these lists is not a coded message, but a motive to legitimize power by stitching the present into a grand, orderly past. A careful reading might suggest that the list is less concerned with what happened and more concerned with who should be considered rightful. It's possible that the text works like a ceremonial backbone for authority. If the city is a living creature, the king list is its genealogy polished for company. Historians still argue whether the Sumerian king list should be read primarily as historical record, political propaganda, or a blend that changes depending on which version you're reading, because there are multiple copies and variations across time. That debate matters because it teaches you how to read secrets responsibly. When a text says this is the order of kings, you don't have to swallow it whole or reject it entirely. You can hold it like a warm stone, solid in places, smoothed by hands in others. You walk through a temple courtyard, and your footsteps scuff dust that might contain crushed bits of pottery, straw, and time. You imagine a young apprentice scribe, learning to write by copying lists, repeating signs until his wrist aches. This is where the 70% mainstream ground feels steady. Writing is trained, standardized, taught. Schools existed. Exercises survived. You can see practice tablets where the same sign is pressed again and again, like an ancient version of writing. I will not talk in class 100 times, but there's mist too, and you can let it drift in gently. One interpretation is that those suspiciously long reigns in the king list may function like symbolic storytelling rather than literal timekeeping. They might represent eras, dynasties, or ideological golden ages. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Another cautious explanation could be that scribes were working with incomplete memories and regional traditions, and they did what humans always do. They tried to make a clean timeline out of a messy reality. And what if the timeline is a patchwork stitched to impress the gods? You picture a scribe glancing upward as he writes, as if the ceiling beams are listening. In a cinematic mood, you imagine him thinking, "We need the past to look stable because the river is unpredictable. The harvest can fail, and the city needs confidence." It's a human moment, and it doesn't require anything supernatural to feel mysterious. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian city-states rise and fall in waves, Uruk, Kish, Ur, Lagash, Umma, and many more. Archaeology suggests shifts in power tied to environment trade routes, warfare, irrigation, management, and internal politics. The evidence we do have points to real conflicts between cities, sometimes recorded in inscriptions that celebrate victories, sometimes hinted at in administrative texts that suddenly mention shortages or emergency labor. You can feel the temptation to treat the king list like a magical key that unlocks a secret ancient calendar. But let me rephrase that more carefully. It might support the idea that Mesopotamians were deeply invested in organizing time as a story, not merely counting years like a stopwatch. That raises the possibility that some historical documents were designed to be performed, recited and believed, shaping identity as much as memory. This is suggestive, not conclusive. A fringe idea proposes that the king list preserves a memory of a prehistory that modern archaeology has not fully recovered, with those huge reign lengths reflecting a lost age before recorded history. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because the numbers feel like they want to mean something. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can say maybe those numbers are symbolic, maybe they're ideological, maybe they're the echo of oral traditions that inflated with each retelling. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here the lost age claim is thin. The more cautious mainstream approach is that the list is a literary and political artifact, not a literal timeline back to the dawn of humanity. Still, you don't have to throw away the wonder. The wonder can be human. Imagine living in a world where your city is young but already feels ancient, where your grandparents remember floods and famine, where you can point to a temple and say, "This place has always been here," even if always is only a few generations. You can see why scribes might want to stretch the past like dough, making it long enough to feed everyone's need for permanence. And you can see why modern scholars, careful and cautious, try to separate the firm bread from the poetic air bubbles. You drift toward a storage room where jars sit in neat rows, and you realize that lists are the shadow of storage. A list is the voice of a room full of goods. It says, "I exist, I matter, I belong to someone." That's the secret writing makes ownership visible. It also makes hierarchy visible. Who gets listed? Who gets counted? Who gets ignored? Most historians agree that social stratification is present in early Mesopotamian cities. Archaeology suggests differences in housing, burial goods, and access to resources. The evidence we do have points to systems of labor and distribution that benefit some more than others. In ration tablets, you might see allotments assigned by status. It's possible that these texts preserve the quiet truth of inequality more clearly than any heroic poem. And the night stays sleepy, even as the content is serious, because you're not here to get angry at history. You're here to let it wash over you like warm air. Still, you can't help a gentle modern aside. If you think your workplace has too many meetings, imagine living in a world where your entire civilization is basically one continuous meeting about barley. The reed stylus taps again in your mind. Tap, press, lift. Tap, press, lift. You hold on to that rhythm as you step out of the storeroom and back into the open air, where the sky is hazy with dust and the stars feel both close and far. The lists, the kings, the suspicious timelines, they're all part of the same human project, making life legible. And what if that's the real secret of Section 2? Not that the ancients hid a forbidden truth, but that they tried to tame time itself with narrative, like tying a rope around a river. The rope might slip, the river might laugh, but the attempt is written in clay, and you can still read the effort in the wedge marks, steady as a heartbeat. You keep walking, as if your feet never fully touch the ground, like you're drifting on warm air over a landscape that smells faintly of river water and sun-baked reeds. The reed stylus stays with you tucked behind your ear in your imagination, the way someone might tuck a pencil there and then forget it's there until it falls dramatically at the worst moment. In the distance you hear water, not loud, not threatening, just present. In Mesopotamia, water is never just scenery, it's a ruler. Most historians agree that the Tigris and Euphrates shape everything here. Farming travel borders and the rhythm of fear and gratitude. Archaeology suggests that floods happen often enough to be remembered, but unpredictably enough to be dreaded. The evidence we do have points to a land where too little water means famine, and too much water means ruin, and the difference can be a single season of bad luck. And this is where the third secret begins to glow softly in the dark, the flood that won't stay put. What's broadly accepted is that flood stories are widespread in Mesopotamian literature. Text traditions include versions that are older than the Hebrew Bible's Genesis account, though they're not identical, and they likely share themes and cultural conversations across the region. The mainstream view is that these stories reflect a mix of mythic storytelling and the lived reality of catastrophic flooding. Archaeology suggests multiple local flood layers at different sites and times, rather than a single worldwide flood covering the planet. The evidence we do have points to real floods that could feel world-ending to the people standing in them. One interpretation is that later scribes inheriting scattered memories and older tales might have blended multiple disasters into one great narrative. A careful reading might suggest that what looks like one flood is actually the cultural memory of many floods compressed into a single symbolic event. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Another cautious explanation could be that the flood story functions like a moral and cosmic reset button, which is exactly the kind of dramatic device humans love because it makes the mess feel meaningful. Historians still argue whether the earliest flood narratives should be read primarily as mythic literature, inspired by local events as reflections of specific historical floods, or as political and theological commentary dressed in water imagery. Scholars continue to debate how much direct historical memory is preserved in any given version. There's no full consensus, and that's okay. Tonight we can sit with the uncertainty like you'd sit with a warm blanket, not solving it, just letting it be. You find yourself near the riverbank at dusk. The sky turns the color of old copper. The water is dark, thick, slow in places, fast in others, and you can hear it chewing at the edge of the mud. Reeds sway, insects sing. Somewhere behind you, a city wall stands like a confident statement, even though everyone knows mud brick and water have a complicated relationship. Most historians agree that one of the famous versions of the flood story appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Utnapishtim tells of a great deluge and survival by boat. What's broadly accepted is that this story is literature shaped by scribal craft, and it sits within a wider tradition that includes earlier texts like the Atrahasis narrative. Archaeology suggests the stories were copied, adapted, and transmitted for generations, which means the words you read on a tablet are part of a living chain of retelling. And here's where the secret can be approached responsibly. The secret is not the flood really happened exactly as written. That would be too neat. The secret is that the flood story holds several layers at once. Documented ground. Mesopotamian cities do experience real flooding, and catastrophic events can reshape settlement patterns. Interpreted ground scribes might compress and amplify those memories into a single, iconic flood. Imagined mist. What if a particular community experienced a flood so overwhelming that it became the template for every later telling a story that swallowed other stories and became the flood story? Let me rephrase that more carefully. This raises the possibility that when you read a flood narrative, you might be reading both a myth and a memory blended until they can't be cleanly separated. This is suggestive, not conclusive. You watch a small boat drift by low in the water, loaded with reeds and baskets. Someone poles it along with practiced calm like they've done this 1,000 times. And you realize something a little funny in a sleepy way. If a flood happened tomorrow, you would not build a boat. You would Google how to build a boat, watch 3 minutes of a video, get distracted by a recommended clip titled Top 10 Ancient Secrets You Won't Believe, and then complain that your phone is at 3% battery. Meanwhile, ancient people are out here treating boat building like a normal Tuesday skill. Archaeology suggests boat technology and river transport are central to this world. The evidence we do have points to networks of movement goods, people, ideas. Water carries everything, including stories. It's possible that flood narratives travel along the same routes as trade, adapting to local anxieties and local pride. Now, the misty part. A fringe idea proposes that the flood narratives preserve a memory of a massive catastrophic event beyond local flooding, perhaps tied to regional climate shifts or dramatic changes in river systems. This theory isn't widely accepted in its more extreme forms, especially when it tries to map the story onto a single global flood. Most historians agree that the global flood interpretation is not supported by mainstream geology. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here, for a worldwide flood, as described in later religious traditions, the evidence is thin. But you can still ask gentle what-if questions that don't pretend to be final answers. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if it's pointing at how humans cope with disasters? How they turn trauma into narrative? How they explain survival as both luck and meaning? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Whose flood was it first? Which river? Overflow inspired which line? How much is memory and how much is metaphor? You step into a scribal room again, and this time you see a tablet with a story on it, not a ration list. The scribe's hand is steadier, slower, like he knows he's shaping something meant to last. You can almost feel the weight of copying. If you change one sign, you change the story. And yet copying always changes a story because humans are humans, And scribes are not photocopiers, they're artists with responsibilities. Most historians agree that scribal culture is conservative, but not frozen. Archaeology suggests texts were copied in schools, libraries, and temple contexts, sometimes with variations. The evidence we do have points to a tradition that values stability but allows drift. That drift is where some of the hidden aspects live. A careful reading might suggest that changes in flood narratives reflect changing social concerns, kingship justice, divine order, human responsibility. Historians still argue whether the flood story's moral focus shifts over time in response to political and theological developments, because different versions emphasize different things. Some highlight human noise annoying gods, some highlight injustice, some highlight fate, some highlight survival. Scholars continue to debate what each emphasis tells us about the society that copied it. You walk back toward the river, and the water seems calmer now, but you know better than to trust it. The reeds hiss softly. The air cools. You hear the distant clack of the stylus again, and you realize the flood secret is also a writing secret. Clay tablets survive because floods bake them, sometimes accidentally firing them in the chaos of collapsed buildings or burned structures. It's an irony that feels almost too perfect water threatens to erase, but disaster can also preserve. To be clear, that's not a magical claim. It's a practical one. When clay gets fired, it becomes more durable. Archaeology suggests many tablets survive because of accidental firing and destruction layers. The evidence we do have points to catastrophe as an unwitting archivist. That's a strange comfort in a way. The world breaks, and somehow the record remains. And now you let yourself sit with the final what if for this section, soft and cinematic. What if a single flood night with rain hammering roofs and water filling streets is the moment someone decides we have to write this down? Not to scare future people, not to prove anything, but to remember. To give shape to chaos. To make survival feel like a story with a beginning and an end. You don't solve it. You don't need to. You just keep walking, the stylus. Tapping time, the river whispering in the dark, and the clay holding the question like a quiet secret that refuses to stay in one place. The river stays beside you, like a long, patient thought, but the night begins to tilt your gaze upward. You don't stop walking. You just let your attention rise from mud brick walls to roof lines, from roof lines to smoke from smoke to the sky. The reed stylus is still there in your mind, tapping its gentle rhythm. And now you start to notice how often the ancients look up and then look back down, as if the heavens and the storeroom are 2 pages of the same ledger. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian scholars took the sky seriously, not in the casual, wow, pretty stars way, but in the committed, let's track this for centuries way. Archaeology suggests that by the first millennium BCE, Babylonian astronomer priests developed sophisticated observational astronomy, recording planetary motions, eclipses, and cycles with impressive accuracy. The evidence we do have points to systematic skywatching, careful note-taking, and a tradition of observation that feeds later scientific developments. And here's the 4th secret pressed into clay with the same patient wedge marks, star charts on wet clay. What's broadly accepted is that many celestial texts are practical records, not just mystical poetry. They include observational diaries, omen compilations, and lists that correlate sky events with earthly expectations. To modern ears, omen can sound like pure superstition, but one interpretation is that omen systems are also early attempts at pattern recognition, the human brain doing what it always does, noticing repetition, building models, trying to reduce uncertainty. A careful reading might suggest that beneath the divination language, some tablets encode real cycles, the timing of Venus's appearances, the predictability of lunar months, the rhythm of eclipses. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it's grounded in the fact that you can't make reliable predictions without reliable observations. A more cautious explanation could be that these texts blend two impulses, the scientific impulse to measure and the cultural impulse to interpret. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian astronomy should be framed primarily as proto-science as a religious practice or as an inseparable fusion of both, because the categories we use now don't map cleanly onto their world. Scholars continue to debate how objective the observations were meant to be, and how much the goal was knowledge for its own sake versus knowledge for guidance and authority. There's no full consensus, and that's part of what makes it so quietly fascinating. You stand in a courtyard at night where the air finally cools, and you feel that little shift in the body that comes when heat loosens its grip. Above you, the stars look sharper than they do in most modern cities, because there are no neon signs, no screen glow, no neighbor's porch light that's somehow brighter than the sun. The sky is a black bowl scattered with cold sparks. You hear someone nearby murmuring, counting, naming, pointing. Most historians agree that constellations and star names in Mesopotamia influence later traditions, though not in a straight line with perfect continuity. Archaeology suggests a long chain of transmission, with ideas moving across languages and empires. The evidence we do have points to scribes and scholars who treat the sky as a text you can read, if you learn the signs. Now here comes the hidden secret feeling, the part that makes your brain want to sit up, even though we're trying to drift you towards sleep. The secret is that what looks like prophecy might sometimes be bookkeeping. A tablet that says, Venus appeared on this date, is in one sense a religious omen record. In another sense, it's data collection. If you copy it year after year, you can notice patterns. And once you notice patterns, you can predict. And once you can predict, people start thinking you're magical. It's the oldest trick in the world. Do math quietly and let everyone else call it prophecy. Let me rephrase that more carefully. This might support the idea that some predictive power in omen texts comes from accumulated observation rather than divine whispering. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it doesn't require dismissing belief. Belief and observation can coexist. In fact, in this world, they often do. You imagine a scholar scribe with tired eyes sitting with a tablet on his knee, glancing up, then down, then up again. The reed stylus presses marks the moon's shape, a planet's position, the day count. He is patient in a way you are not. You would get distracted within 10 minutes. You'd be like, I'll track Mars every night. And then you'd miss 3 nights because you found a really good bread recipe. Ancient scholars do not have that luxury. Or maybe they do, but the bread is probably barley and no one is getting excited about it. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian month-naming lunar calendars and intercalation practices reflect careful timekeeping. The evidence we do have points to a culture that measures time as a blend of celestial rhythm and administrative need. You can feel it. The same mind that wants to know when Venus rises also wants to know when taxes are due. Stars and grain, heaven and storage, it's all one system. It's now the misty, what if that has to be framed carefully? A fringe idea proposes that some ancient star records preserve knowledge from a much older, forgotten civilization, implying an inherited astronomical science. This theory isn't widely accepted, and most historians agree that the evidence fits better with gradual development within known cultural timelines. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and here it's thin. But the idea persists because the achievements feel impressive, and people love a hidden teacher behind every lesson. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the gentler version is simply this: what if knowledge travels farther than we notice, not from lost super civilizations, but from neighboring cities, traveling scholars, captured scribes, diplomatic gifts, marriages, and trade routes? What if a technique for counting days, for spotting a cycle, moves like a whisper across borders? That's not fringe, that's human. And then there's another secret, smaller, quieter. The sky isn't just studied, it's used to tell stories about meaning. Omen texts often tie events above to events below, which can sound silly until you remember that humans still do this, just with different tools. You see a stock market chart dip, and you say the universe is against you. You see a cloudy morning, and you decide the day is cursed. We have not evolved past interpretation. We've just changed the font. Historians still argue whether omen literature primarily reflects genuine belief in cosmic causality or reflects political and social strategies for decision-making, because omens can justify choices after the fact. Scholars continue to debate how these texts functioned in court and temple contexts. Were they consulted like weather reports? Were they performed like theater? Were they both? You keep your tone sleepy because this isn't a lecture hall. It's a late-night walk. You notice the sound of the reed stylus again. But now it's joined by another sound, a soft scraping, like someone smoothing a tablet to reuse it. That detail matters. It reminds you that clay is a working material. Notes can be erased. Texts can be recopied. Knowledge is both durable and fragile, depending on whether someone decides it's worth keeping. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the secret hidden in the star tablets is not mystical at all, but the human ability to build long-term data sets? You think about that word long-term, and you feel how rare it is. Most of us can't commit to watering a plant for 3 weeks. These people commit to watching the sky for generations. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, what nights were missed, what observations were lost, what errors were copied, what insights never made it into clay. And yet, the evidence we do have points to something steady and beautiful: careful eyes, patient hands, and a belief that the cosmos is readable. Whether you call it science, religion, or both, it's a practice of attention. And attention is one of the most soothing things a human can experience because it slows you down. It makes you present. So you stand under the stars a moment longer, letting the cool air settle on your skin. You hear the distant river. You feel the city behind you heavy with grain and taxes and arguments and laughter. Above you, the sky keeps turning. And you, sleepy traveler, walk forward with the reed stylus still tapping time, following the quiet line where solid ground meets mist. Your eyes come back down from the stars, the way a tired mind returns from a daydream, gently, without snapping. The sky is still there, turning slowly like it always does, but your attention slides toward the city again, toward walls that hold heat, toward courtyards that smell like dust and bread, toward the places where people are busy being people. The reed stylus remains your little anchor, tucked in your imagination, because in this world, everything that matters tends to be pressed into clay sooner or later. Most historians agree that in Sumerian and broader Mesopotamian texts, gods show up everywhere. They're in hymns, myths, royal inscriptions, and sometimes even in administrative documents, like a divine signature on daily life. Archaeology suggests temples are not just spiritual spaces, but major economic centers controlling land, labor storage, and distribution. The evidence we do have points to a society where religion and administration aren't separate departments. They're one building with different rooms. And this is where the fifth secret begins: gods as administrators, not just myths. What's broadly accepted is that many Sumerian tablets treat the divine world as structured, hierarchical, and organized, almost like a government. Deities have domains, they have titles, they have responsibilities, they have temples that function like offices. Most historians agree that this reflects how people imagine order. They project human systems upward, and then they let that projected order shape their society in return. One interpretation is that when a text says a god owns a field, receives offerings, or commands certain work, it might be describing real institutional control using sacred language. A careful reading might suggest that divine names can stand in for temple households, priestly administrations, or city identities. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it depends on the specific text. A more cautious explanation could be that people genuinely believed the gods were present, and the administrative system grew around that belief. Either way, the practical outcome is similar. Temples are powerful. Historians still argue whether temple economies were primarily centralized redistribution systems or whether they coexisted with robust private trade and household production, because the archaeological and textual record shows a complex mix. Scholars continue to debate how far temple control reached into daily life and how much autonomy individuals and families retained. There's no full consensus. And that uncertainty is part of the secret feeling. You can see the outlines of the system, but not every moving part. You drift into a temple precinct in your mind, and the place is calmer than the street, not silent, but controlled. The air smells of oil and incense and warm brick. A worker carries a basket of grain. Someone else counts jars. A priest recites something softly. You notice how familiar it feels in a weird way. If you swapped the baskets for clipboards, you'd basically be in a modern warehouse, except with better chanting and fewer fluorescent lights. Most historians agree that major gods like Anu, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, and others anchor Sumerian religious imagination, though their roles and prominence shift over time and between cities. Archaeology suggests temples and cult centers are tied to city identity politics and legitimacy. The evidence we do have points to a world where to rule a city is also to manage its relationship with its patron deity, because that relationship is a source of authority. Now here's the secret angle that hides inside this mainstream reality. The secret is not that gods are secretly aliens running an ancient bureaucracy. That's the kind of leap that sounds exciting, but skips the careful steps. Instead, the secret is that myth and administration are braided together. The divine world provides a model of order. Order provides stability. Stability supports power. Power reinforces the divine model. It's a loop. Let me rephrase that more carefully. This raises the possibility that some mythic language in tablets functions as a social technology, a way to coordinate people at scale. When you tell a community, this grain belongs to the God you create, a shared reason to protect it, store it, distribute it, and accept rules about it. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it's a plausible interpretation supported by how institutions often work. You watch a scribe stamp a cylinder seal into wet clay. The tiny carved scene rolls across the surface like a miniature movie, a figure before a deity, a procession, an emblem. The seal leaves an impression that says, "This is official." Archaeology suggests cylinder seals are widespread and serve as identity markers, authorization tools, and artistic expression. The evidence we do have points to bureaucratic sophistication, because a seal is basically an ancient password, except you can't forget it, and you definitely can't write it on a sticky note and leave it on your monitor. And that makes you smile a little, because if you're honest, you would lose your cylinder seal within 12 minutes. You would be like, I said it right here, and then you'd find it in your sandal later. Ancient bureaucracy not forgiving. Now the misty part handled safely. A fringe idea proposes that some depictions of gods, their me, and their supernatural authority encode references to advanced technology or non-human beings. This theory isn't widely accepted, and most historians agree that mythic imagery is symbolic and culturally grounded. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and in the technology literalism version it's thin. But the popularity of the idea points to something real. The texts are vivid, and humans love to translate the unfamiliar into the dramatic. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask softer questions. What if the stories are pointing at a kind of social power that feels supernatural because it's larger than any one person? A temple complex that controls land, grain, and labor can feel godlike to a farmer who just wants his ration and a nap. A king who claims divine favor can feel untouchable. The mystery may be in how systems become so big they start to feel like beings. Most historians agree that kingship in Mesopotamia is often framed as divinely sanctioned. Archaeology suggests monumental building, and inscriptions emphasize legitimacy and divine support. The evidence we do have points to rulers using religious language to strengthen political control, which is not unique to Sumer. It's a human habit. Historians still argue whether certain royal titles and claims reflect actual theological beliefs held by rulers, calculated propaganda aimed at subjects, or a mixture that changes depending on circumstance. Scholars continue to debate how ordinary people experience this, whether they felt comforted, coerced, inspired, or simply resigned, like someone who sighs and says, "Well, that's the system." You walk past a line of workers in your imagination, each carrying something: baskets, bricks, reeds. You notice how the temple is both sanctuary and machine, and you notice the language of gifts and offerings that might also be the language of taxation. To be clear, this is debated. Some offerings are devotional, some are obligatory. Some are both because humans can be sincere and strategic in the same breath. And here comes a cinematic, what if that stays gentle? What if on some tablets, the gods are less like supernatural beings and more like the voice of the institution itself, speaking through ritual? What if the command is a policy? What if the divine favor is political stability? And what if the miracle is not a lightning bolt, but the quiet fact that thousands of people coordinate their lives around shared symbols? You can feel how that becomes a secret, not hidden, but easy to miss, because we expect ancient religion to be either naive superstition or pure poetry. The reality is messier and therefore more human. The tablets suggest a world where belief and administration live in the same room, where a hymn and a receipt can share the same shelf. The reed stylus taps again, slow and steady. Tap, press, lift. You let it soothe you. You let the temple courtyard fade into a softer blur. And you keep the solid ground separate from the mist, remembering the rule we set. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You step out of the temple precinct and back toward the street where the city breathes. Somewhere someone is arguing about grain. Somewhere someone is singing quietly. Somewhere a scribe is pressing wedges that will outlast all of them. And you, sleepy traveler, carry the fifth secret forward. The gods may be stories, but the administration is very real. And sometimes the story is how the administration stays standing. You keep gliding forward through the city without any sharp breaks, like your mind is floating on the steady fan hum back home. The temple courtyard fades behind you, but the sense of order stays. Because in a place like this, order is not a luxury, it's survival. The reed stylus is still your little metronome. Tap, press, lift. Tap, press, lift. And now the wedges it makes start looking less like letters and more like numbers, because the sixth secret is waiting where math meets mud. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian societies developed sophisticated systems of measurement and calculation early on, especially for managing land-grain labor and trade. Archaeology suggests standardized weights measures and accounting practices emerge alongside urban growth. The evidence we do have points to people who can't afford to be casual about quantities because a miscounted harvest isn't an inconvenience. It's winter hunger. So you step into a space that feels like a workshop and an office at the same time. A man holds a balance scale. Small stones sit in a basket, each one representing a known weight. A scribe watches stylus ready. Someone pours grain into a container. Someone else counts out portions. There's no drama, but there is tension. The quiet tension of people who know numbers decide fairness. And here is the sixth secret measuring the world with reeds and ropes. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerians and later Mesopotamians used standardized systems for weights and capacity, and they developed strong mathematical traditions. Most historians agree that the base 60 sexagesimal system becomes a hallmark of Mesopotamian math, influencing how we still measure time and angles today. Archaeology suggests that mathematical tablets, including school exercises and practical problems, show real competence in arithmetic geometry, like reasoning and problem solving, aimed at everyday needs. One interpretation is that the sacred feel of numbers in some texts might not be mystical at all. A careful reading might suggest that numbers are sacred because they are powerful, and they are powerful because they keep the system running. That's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that religious symbolism and practical calculation coexist because in human life, the profound and the practical are always sharing a table. Historians still argue whether the development of advanced mathematical methods in Mesopotamia is driven primarily by administrative needs, by scribal education traditions, or by intellectual curiosity that becomes its own cultural value. Scholars continue to debate how much of this math is applied versus theoretical, because even when it looks like a school problem, it can reflect deeper conceptual thinking. You watch a surveyor in your imagination holding a rope and a measuring rod. He walks the edge of a field, counting steps, noting corners. The ground is dry and cracked. The field lines are both physical and political. A boundary is a promise, and promises are the kind of thing that gets people into trouble. Archaeology suggests land management is crucial in irrigated agriculture, with canals, levees, and fields requiring coordination and maintenance. The evidence we do have points to bureaucratic oversight because when water is controlled by canals, whoever controls canal labor controls survival. And this is where the secret deepens. Math is not just math, it's authority. Let me rephrase that more carefully. This might support the idea that the ability to measure and record quantities gives certain groups power: scribes, administrators, temple officials, kings. That raises the possibility that math is one of the earliest tools of governance. Not because it's evil, but because it's effective. A number is hard to argue with when it's written in clay and stamped with a seal. You can argue with a person. Arguing with a tablet is like arguing with an email from payroll. You can do it, but you probably won't win. Now you get one of your light jokes because you deserve it. Imagine telling an ancient scribe, "I'm bad at math." He would blink at you like you just said, "I'm bad at breathing." Then he'd hand you a tablet with 300 practice problems and say, "Congrats, you live here now." Most historians agree that scribal education involves repetitive exercises, including math and writing. Archaeology suggests schools where apprentices copy signs, solve calculations, and learn standard formats. The evidence we do have points to a system that trains people to think in structured ways, which is one reason cities can function at scale. Now the misty part, handled safely again. A fringe idea proposes that Mesopotamian numerical systems encode hidden cosmological knowledge like advanced astronomy or secret harmonic ratios that prove some lost esoteric science. This theory isn't widely accepted. Most historians agree that the base 60 system can be explained by practical and historical factors, including divisibility and earlier counting traditions. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and the hidden cosmic code claim is thin in its most dramatic forms. But you can still enjoy a calmer what if. What if the numbers feel cosmic simply because they're used to measure cosmic things, time months, planetary cycles, angles, temple plans? What if the same system that counts barley also counts days, and that makes it feel like the city is synchronized with the sky? That's an interpretation, not a certainty, and it's a gentle one. You walk toward a canal in the dim light. The water moves with a low sound, like someone pouring slowly from a jug. A worker repairs a bank with packed clay, pressing it firm. His hands are muddy. His face is tired. He is doing math with his body. How much clay, how much force, how wide the bank needs to be so it won't collapse next flood. You realize that measurement is not only abstract, it's lived. Most historians agree that canal systems require ongoing maintenance and organized labor. Archaeology suggests communal and institutional involvement because canals don't clean themselves and silt doesn't politely exit on its own. The evidence we do have points to scheduling rationing and record-keeping tied directly to water management. Historians still argue whether certain administrative reforms and standardizations reflect centralized state power emerging over time, or reflect local city-based systems that remain fragmented. Scholars continue to debate the extent of political centralization in different periods and regions. Again, no full consensus. Again, that's okay. Now you find yourself back in the scribal room where a tablet sits with neat columns of marks. You can sense the satisfaction in the layout rows, aligned quantities, recorded totals, tallied. It's a quiet beauty, the beauty of order. And it's also a quiet warning because order can become rigid. A careful reading might suggest that systems of measurement can turn people into numbers, reducing a worker's life to a ration line. That's an interpretation, not a certainty, but it's a human possibility worth holding, gently. You notice the reed stylus again, and you realize the motif has shifted. It's no longer just a writing tool. It's a measuring tool in spirit. It turns messy reality into marks. It makes the world countable. And once the world is countable, it can be planned, taxed, redistributed, controlled, improved, exploited, protected, all of it. The stylus doesn't choose. People choose. So the sixth secret settles into you like a warm weight. The earliest cities are built not only with bricks and belief, but with measurement. Reeds and ropes, weights and measures, columns and totals. And if you let your mind drift into a soft cinematic mood, you can imagine the city at night as a giant living equation. Its canals like lines of text, its storerooms like memory, its temples like headings, its people like moving numbers. You don't have to solve the equation. You just have to feel how the clay holds it quietly, steadily as you keep walking into the next part of the night. You keep drifting forward, and the city feels softer now, like the edges blur the way they do when you're finally getting sleepy. The canal sound fades behind you. The temple scent fades too. But the reed stylus remains tapping in your mind because it's the one constant in this whole world of clay and numbers. Tap, press, lift. Tap, press, lift. And now, instead of numbers and measures, your attention lands on something smaller but strangely powerful, a name. Most historians agree that names in ancient Mesopotamia are not casual labels. They can be prayers, statements, family histories, and social signals all at once. Archaeology suggests personal seals, inscriptions, and administrative lists preserve names in huge quantities, which gives modern scholars a rare glimpse into real individuals, not just kings and gods. The evidence we do have points to a world where being named is being counted, being seen, being placed in a system. And here is the seventh secret, the strange power of names. What's broadly accepted is that many tablets are lists of people, workers, dependents, officials, messengers, musicians, temple staff, and sometimes entire households. Some names appear once and vanish. Others recur across years, across documents, across different cities. Most historians agree that repeated names can reveal careers, family connections, and institutional continuity. Though it's not always simple because people can share names and scribes can spell creatively, one interpretation is that names on tablets are like threads in a massive woven cloth. A careful reading might suggest that if you follow the right thread, one official who keeps appearing, one messenger who travels, one priestess who holds a title, you can glimpse networks of power that aren't obvious in the grand myths. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it's a grounded way to see hidden secrets. The secret isn't a coded message. The secret is the pattern. Historians still argue whether we can confidently identify the same individual across multiple texts when names repeat because the evidence can be ambiguous. Scholars continue to debate how to separate coincidence from continuity, especially when a name is common. There's no full consensus, and you can feel how careful scholarship has to be here. One wrong assumption, and you accidentally turn three different men named Shoe Nonsense into a single superhuman bureaucrat who apparently lived for 120 years. You walk past a scribal bench where a tablet lies open, and you see a line of names with quantities beside them: rations, allotments, distributions. It's quiet, almost tender in a strange way, because you're looking at a system that doesn't care about your inner life, but still has to keep you alive. Barley for you, oil for you, wool for you, maybe beer if you behaved. And honestly, the fact that beer is often part of ancient rations is the kind of historical detail that makes you feel a sudden respect for management. Not always, but sometimes. Most historians agree that ration lists and administrative records reflect institutional labor and dependency systems. Archaeology suggests these documents can show household structures, workforce organization, and economic stress. The evidence we do have points to real lives moving through categories that modern people would find both familiar and uncomfortable: worker, dependent, apprentice, slave, servant, official. The tablets are not always kind, but they are honest in their own administrative way. Now the secret deepens. Names carry status. Titles carry authority. You see it in the way certain individuals are labeled: overseer, scribe, priest, royal messenger. A careful reading might suggest that titles are like keys opening doors inside the system. That's an interpretation, not a certainty, but it fits how institutions work. Let me rephrase that more carefully. This raises the possibility that some tablets preserve social hierarchies more clearly than myths do, because myths can be lofty and symbolic, while a ration list is blunt. The list shows who gets more, who gets less, who gets nothing at all. It's suggestive, not conclusive, but it's real data pressed into clay. You notice cylinder seals again, those rolling signatures. Most historians agree they function as markers of identity and authorization. Archaeology suggests seals are owned by officials, merchants, and others who need to authenticate transactions. The evidence we do have points to a world where trust is built through objects and marks. You can't just say, "Trust me, bro." You need a seal. And here comes your sleepy modern aside. Imagine forgetting your seal at home. You show up to the storeroom like, "I swear it's me." And the guard is like, "That's adorable. Come back with your tiny carved identity cylinder." Ancient security is both strict and artsy. Now the misty part handled safely. A fringe idea proposes that certain repeated names and titles are not human individuals at all, but coded references to secret orders, priestly conspiracies, or hidden lineages guarding forbidden knowledge. This theory isn't widely accepted. Most historians agree that the simplest explanation for repeated names is administrative continuity, family naming traditions, and scribal record keeping. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and here it's thin, but we can still ask a calmer what if without pretending it's fact. What if some names carry layers of meaning that we don't fully recover? Many Mesopotamian names include references to gods, virtues, or hopes. What if a name is a miniature sentence, a wish pressed into identity? What if your name is basically your parents saying, "Please let the universe be nice to this child"? That's not conspiracy, that's parenting. Most historians agree that theophoric names, names containing a deity's name, are common in the ancient Near East. Archaeology suggests names can reflect local cults and shifting religious emphasis. The evidence we do have points to cultural patterns. Certain gods become more popular. Certain names cluster in certain places. Certain titles reflect certain institutions. Historians still argue whether shifts in naming patterns reflect genuine changes in belief, political changes, or administrative fashion, because human naming is complicated. Scholars continue to debate how much we can infer about identity and social affiliation from names alone. No full consensus again. You drift toward a small household space away from the grand temple. A woman kneads dough. A child watches. Someone repairs a reed mat. And you realize something that feels like a secret, even though it's obvious most people's lives never make it into epic poems. They make it into lists. That's the quiet truth. The tablet doesn't preserve your feelings. It preserves your ration. It preserves your assignment. It preserves your name. And yet the name is enough to make you pause. Because a name is a doorway for imagination. You see Jeme and Lil, or Lu Inanna, or any other name, and you think this was a person who woke up and felt the heat and got thirsty and laughed at something stupid and worried about a child and got tired. The clay doesn't say that, but the clay makes it possible to wonder. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the hidden secret of names is that they let us recover social networks, the invisible wiring of a city? A messenger's name appears in one city, then another. An official signs off on deliveries year after year. A household head receives rations for dependents, revealing family structures. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm: which names belong to which faces, how relationships felt, how loyalty worked, how love worked. You return to the scribal bench in your mind. The reed stylus presses another line. Tap, press, lift. Tap, press, lift. A name appears. A title appears. A number appears. The city becomes legible again, and you carry the seventh secret forward like a small warm stone in your pocket. In Sumerian tablets, the hidden stories often live inside the names, not because the names are secret codes, but because they are the closest thing we have to hearing ordinary people speak across millennia. You keep walking still in that second-person drift where your body is relaxed, but your mind keeps taking gentle steps. The city feels quieter now, as if the day workers have gone home, and only the night shift worries are still awake. The reed stylus remains your steady sound, tapping like a soft clock. Tap, press, lift. Tap, press, lift. And then without warning, you notice something else in the air. Not a sound, a feeling. The kind of feeling that makes people glance at the sky, or at a doorway, or at the way a candle flame leans. The kind of feeling that says something is about to happen, and I'd like a little guidance, please. Most historians agree that omen literature is a major part of Mesopotamian textual culture, especially in later periods, and that it influences decision-making in everything from medicine to politics. Archaeology suggests large collections of omens were copied and preserved, implying institutional importance. The evidence we do have points to a society that treats uncertainty as something you can manage by categorizing it. And here is the eighth secret: dreams, omens, and the science of worry. What's broadly accepted is that many tablets contain omen series, interpretations of unusual events, celestial signs, animal behavior, birth anomalies, weather patterns, and everyday oddities. To modern ears, this can sound like pure superstition, but one interpretation is that omen systems are structured ways of making sense of randomness. A careful reading might suggest they operate like early risk assessment. If you notice pattern A, prepare for outcome B. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it helps explain why so many rulers and officials took these texts seriously. A more cautious explanation could be that omen interpretation provided both psychological comfort and political justification. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian divination practices should be viewed primarily as genuine religious belief, as proto-scientific pattern recognition, or as a social tool for authority, because the same system can serve multiple functions at once. Scholars continue to debate how ordinary people engaged with omens compared to elites, since many of the surviving texts reflect scribal and court contexts. You step into a room lit by oil lamps. The light is soft and yellow, making shadows on the walls look like they're breathing. A man sits rubbing his temple. A scribe sits nearby with a tablet ready. Someone else stands at the doorway like a guard, half listening. Outside, the city is quiet, but inside, worry is loud. The man speaks. He had a dream. In it, the river rose, but it rose in a strange way, too fast, too clean, like a wall of glass. He woke up sweating. Now he wants meaning. Most historians agree that dream interpretation is part of Mesopotamian divinatory practice. The evidence we do have points to organized dream reading traditions, where dreams can be treated as messages, warnings, or reflections of the divine. One interpretation is that the dream tablet is less about supernatural certainty and more about giving language to anxiety. A careful reading might suggest that the act of recording a dream and matching it to interpretations is a way of making fear manageable. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it fits the human brain. Your brain hates loose ends. It wants a story, it wants a category. It wants to say, if this, then that, even when life refuses to cooperate. Let me rephrase that more carefully. This might support the idea that omen texts function partly as emotional technology. They provide scripts for how to respond. They offer rituals, precautions, prayers, or actions. This raises the possibility that divination is not only about predicting the future, but about regulating the present. That's suggestive, not conclusive. Now, you get one of your light jokes because you can't have an ancient science of worry section without acknowledging your modern talents. If you lived here, you would be the person with a dream, like I saw a goat wearing my sandals, and you'd be like, "Is that bad?" And the omen specialist would sigh deeply and say, "It means you should stop eating heavy barley stew before bed." Honestly, some parts of ancient wisdom are timeless. Most historians agree that omen collections are often compiled systematically with hundreds or thousands of entries. Archaeology suggests these are copied over long periods, implying a scholarly tradition. The evidence we do have points to a world where knowledge is cataloged relentlessly. If a lizard falls from the ceiling on a Tuesday, someone somewhere is writing it down, and you respect that dedication even if it makes you wonder how anyone got any sleep. Historians still argue whether the order and categorization in Omen series reflects empirical observation, literary convention, or institutional training, because a structured list can reflect many things: method, habit, or tradition. Scholars continue to debate how often these omens were tested against outcomes versus simply preserved as inherited wisdom. There's no full consensus. Now, the misty part handled safely. A fringe idea proposes that certain omen texts encode secret warnings about catastrophic cycles, hidden astronomical doom schedules, lost calendars of disaster, or suppressed knowledge about periodic resets. This theory isn't widely accepted. Most historians agree that omen literature reflects cultural interpretation rather than objective forecasting of global events. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and here it's thin. But you can still enjoy the cinematic what-if mood without turning it into a conclusion. What if some omens preserve memories of real events, floods, famines, invasions that made such an impression they became embedded in interpretive traditions, not as exact predictions, but as echoes? A careful reading might suggest that when a society experiences repeated disruptions, it becomes obsessed with signs. That's an interpretation, not a certainty. And it doesn't require hidden apocalypses. It requires human vulnerability. You move through a marketplace the next morning in your imagination, where an old woman watches birds and shakes her head, muttering something like, "Not a good sign." You smile because you've heard modern versions of this too. Someone sees a black cat. Someone sees a broken mirror. Someone reads their horoscope. We still do it. We still want the universe to send us a memo. Most historians agree that divination in Mesopotamia is often tied to statecraft. Archaeology suggests specialists served royal courts, interpreting celestial events and unusual occurrences. The evidence we do have points to divination as both belief and governance, a way to advise, to legitimize, to warn, to delay decisions until a better sign appears. In a world without modern meteorology or economics, omens are a kind of guidance system. Historians still argue whether divination practices were used cynically by elites or sincerely as part of a shared worldview, because human motivation is layered. Scholars continue to debate how much agency diviners had, whether they could shape outcomes by shaping interpretations. Again, no full consensus. You return to the scribal bench, and the reed stylus presses a dream into clay. Tap, press, lift. Tap, press, lift. The tablet becomes a container for something invisible: worry. You realize that's the eighth secret. These texts are not just about predicting. They are about coping. They are about giving the mind a place to put uncertainty so it doesn't spill everywhere. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the ancient secret is that humans have always tried to tame the future, not by controlling it, but by narrating it? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm: which dreams came true, which omens were coincidence, which interpretations helped people act wisely, which ones simply soothed them until morning. You don't need an answer to fall asleep. You just need the steady rhythm of the stylus, the soft lamplight, and the sense that even 5,000 years ago, people lay awake, sometimes listening to the world, asking it to make sense. You keep moving forward without a hard seam, like the night is a single long exhale. The dream room fades behind you, and the last lamplight becomes a soft blur. The reed stylus stays with you because it always does, but the air changes again. It starts to smell sharper, bitter, green, like crushed leaves and smoke. You follow that smell the way you'd follow the scent of coffee in the morning, except here it leads to a small workspace where bowls, stones, and jars sit in calm disorder. Someone grinds something with a pestle. The sound is slow and rhythmic, like a heartbeat with a little grit in it. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian medicine blends practical remedies with ritual and incantation. Archaeology suggests medical texts include lists of symptoms, substances, and procedures, sometimes alongside magical language. The evidence we do have points to a world where healing is both a craft and a comfort, where a poultice can sit next to a prayer without anyone seeing a contradiction. And here is the ninth secret healing recipes in quiet laboratories. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian tablets preserve medical knowledge in the form of prescriptions, diagnostic descriptions, and ritual instructions. Some tablets list ingredients, plants, minerals, animal products, and tell you how to prepare them: crush, boil, mix with oil, apply as a plaster, drink as a potion. Most historians agree that these texts reflect a genuine attempt to treat illness, even if the theories of disease differ from modern biology. One interpretation is that incantations in medical texts might not always be magic in the dramatic sense. A careful reading might suggest they serve as reassurance structure and bedside ritual, an ancient way of calming a patient while a remedy does its slow work. That's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that belief itself is part of the healing environment, and ritual creates trust in the healer and hope in the patient, which can matter even when medicine is limited. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian medical practitioners should be seen as primarily empirical healers, primarily ritual specialists, or a blended professional class with different roles, because the texts reflect multiple types of expertise. Scholars continue to debate how much of the preserved pharmacology had measurable effects, and how often treatments were symbolic or comforting rather than physiologically effective. There's no full consensus, and the uncertainty is gentle, because human bodies have always been messy, and ancient evidence is always incomplete. You step closer to the workspace. The healer's hands are stained from herbs. The bowl is rough clay. The pestle is smooth stone, worn by repetition. The smell of oil rises when someone warms it. In your mind, you can almost taste bitterness on your tongue, and you're suddenly grateful you live in an era where you can take a tiny tablet and not have to drink something that looks like swamp tea with ambition. And yes, there's your light joke. You would absolutely be the patient who asks, "Does it have to taste like that?" And the healer would look at you like, Do you want to get better or do you want dessert? Ancient bedside manner is probably not gentle. It's probably practical. Most historians agree that illness in Mesopotamia is often understood through a mix of physical, spiritual, and social frameworks. Archaeology suggests some texts categorize symptoms in ways that show careful observation. The evidence we do have points to diagnostic traditions that attempt to recognize patterns: fever, swelling, pain, weakness. They don't have microscopes, but they do have eyes, and eyes can notice a lot. One interpretation is that some diagnostic tablets might represent early forms of clinical reasoning. A careful reading might suggest that listing symptoms and associating them with likely outcomes or recommended treatments is a structured approach to care. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. We cannot assume ancient categories map neatly onto modern diseases. But the method observe, record, respond feels familiar. Let me rephrase that more carefully. This might support the idea that Mesopotamian healers develop systematic practices within their worldview, even if their explanations differ from ours. This is suggestive, not conclusive. Now, the misty part handled safely. A fringe idea proposes that some ancient medical recipes preserve lost advanced knowledge, miracle cures hidden chemistry, or suppress treatments that modern science somehow missed. This theory isn't widely accepted. Most historians agree that while some remedies may have had real effects, many treatments are limited by available knowledge and the constraints of the time. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And the miracle lost science claim is thin as a sweeping idea. But a gentler what if can still be cinematic without misleading. What if some remedies truly helped more than we expect? Not because they were magical, but because humans learn by trying things. Certain plants have real pharmacological properties. Oils can protect skin. Honey can inhibit some bacteria. Heat can soothe. Cold can reduce swelling. A careful reading might suggest that trial, tradition, and observation slowly built a toolkit, even if no one called it science. Most historians agree that ancient pharmacology across many cultures contains mixtures of effective, neutral, and harmful treatments. Archaeology suggests these practices evolve over time. The evidence we do have points to a living tradition, not a single medical Bible. Historians still argue whether the presence of incantations alongside recipes indicates that practitioners believed illness was primarily supernatural, or whether ritual and remedy were simply complementary approaches. Scholars continue to debate how patients interpreted these practices, whether they sought spiritual reassurance, practical relief, or both. No full consensus. You watch the healer measure ingredients, and you notice how carefully he does it. A pinch, a spoonful, a measured amount of oil. This brings you back to the sixth secret about measurement. Even healing is quantified. The reed stylus might not be in his hand, but the same mindset is present. Turn the world into manageable parts. Make the body a system you can address. You step outside for a moment, and the air feels cleaner. The city is waking up. Somewhere someone is shouting about grain again, because that never stops. You return to the healer's space, and you see a tablet set aside, drying. It holds a recipe. It holds a ritual. It holds the quiet hope of someone who wanted to feel better. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the secret of these healing tablets is that they reveal the ancient world's tenderness? We often imagine antiquity as harsh, brutal, and indifferent. But a prescription is an act of care. A diagnostic list is someone paying attention. Even an incantation is at its core someone saying, "You are not alone in this pain." The mystery isn't in what we know, but but in what we can't confirm, which remedies worked, which were placebo, which harmed, which saved. The tablets don't come with clinical trials. They come with human intent. And intent matters in a sleep story because it softens the edges of history. So you let the scene become quiet. The grinding slows. The oil lamp flickers. The reed stylus taps somewhere else in the city, recording another life, another worry, another attempt to keep things together. And you carry the ninth secret forward in the clay of Mesopotamia. Healing is not just myth or magic. It's a careful blend of observation, tradition, ritual, comfort, and the stubborn human refusal to accept suffering as the final word. You keep drifting forward, and the smell of herbs fades into the background, like a dream dissolving at sunrise. The city's daytime rhythm rises again, but you stay in that slow nighttime pace, as if you're walking through it with cotton in your ears. The reed stylus remains your quiet anchor, tapping in the distance, because even the strangest stories here tend to circle back to clay, to marks, to records. And now the 10th secret arrives in a place you might not expect. Not in a temple storeroom, not under the stars, not in the healer's bowl, but in a story about where everyone ends up, eventually, below ground, below light, below the arguments about barley. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian underworld beliefs appear in myths and literary texts, revealing values, fears, and moral expectations. Archaeology suggests funerary practices vary by period and region, and that texts don't always match burial reality in a simple way. The evidence we do have points to a culture where the afterlife is not always a reward, but often a continuation of order, a realm with rules, gates, and consequences. And here is the 10th secret: underworld travel and moral paperwork. What's broadly accepted is that some Sumerian and Akkadian myths describe journeys to the underworld, including stories associated with deities like Inanna and others. These narratives are literature crafted and copied, meant to be performed and remembered. Most historians agree they aren't literal travel guides, but they can function like maps of meaning, showing what a society fears, values, and hopes to control. One interpretation is that underworld journeys encode social rules in dramatic form. A careful reading might suggest that stories about passing gates, surrendering symbols of status, and facing judgment mirror how power works in the living world. That's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that the underworld is imagined as a reflection of the city itself, bureaucratic, hierarchical, and inevitable. If you can't escape taxes in life, you definitely can't escape paperwork in death. That's not archaeology. That's a human joke. But you get the idea. Historians still argue whether specific underworld narratives preserve older Sumerian religious concepts or reflect later reinterpretations shaped by changing political and cultural contexts, because these texts were copied across centuries. Scholars continue to debate how much these myths reflect popular belief versus elite scribal tradition. There's no full consensus, and the underworld stays partly in mist. You find yourself standing at a symbolic threshold, a doorway carved in your imagination, not in stone, but in shadow. A gate, a guard, a list. Because of course there's a list. The underworld in Mesopotamian imagination often has gates, rules, and procedures. You have to be admitted. You have to follow protocol. It's like the afterlife is run by the same administrative mind that runs the temple storeroom. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian literature often portrays the underworld as a place of darkness and dust, where the dead exist in a diminished state. Archaeology suggests that the living cared for the dead through offerings and remembrance, in various ways, though practices differed. The evidence we do have points to a cultural emphasis on continuity. The dead remain part of the social web requiring attention. One interpretation is that offerings to the dead are not just religious duties, but social stabilizers. A careful reading might suggest that maintaining the dead helps maintain the living family's identity and legitimacy. That's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that honoring the dead is a way of managing grief, turning loss into ritual, so it can be carried without crushing you. Let me rephrase that more carefully. This might support the idea that underworld myths serve psychological and social functions as much as theological ones. This is suggestive, not conclusive. And here comes your light joke, because even in the underworld, you need a little air. Imagine arriving at the gates and being told you filled out your afterlife form incorrectly. Sir, you checked living when you are clearly not. And you're like, but I feel alive. And the gatekeeper just points at the dust on your shoes and says, next. Now, the misty part handled safely. A fringe idea proposes that underworld narratives encode references to real underground structures, hidden tunnels, secret chambers, or literal gates to unknown places, suggesting the myths are records of physical sites rather than symbolic journeys. This theory isn't widely accepted. Most historians agree that underworld stories are primarily mythic and symbolic, even if they draw on real landscapes like caves, tombs, and dark riverbanks. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and in the literal secret tunnel map version, it's thin. But the cinematic what-if can be gentler and still meaningful. What if the underworld stories preserve a memory of actual ritual spaces, dark rooms and temples, subterranean chambers, tombs where priests performed ceremonies with flickering lamps? Not as proof of a literal underworld, but as a source of sensory imagination. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a mood, the smell of oil, the chill of stone, the hush that makes you feel watched, even when no one is there. Most historians agree that ritual and performance are central to ancient religion. Archaeology suggests temples included varied spaces for varied functions. The evidence we do have points to a world where ceremony creates reality for participants, not by changing physics, but by shaping experience. Historians still argue whether the moral themes in underworld narratives reflect social control, encouraging obedience, humility, and reverence, or reflect deeper existential concerns about fate and fairness. Scholars continue to debate how much agency these myths grant humans versus gods. No full consensus. You imagine a story like Inanna's Descent, where status is stripped away at successive gates. A careful reading might suggest that this is about power. What you think protects you doesn't protect you forever. It's possible that the myth teaches humility by dramatizing vulnerability. Another cautious explanation could be that it reflects seasonal cycles and cosmic order linking descent and return to agricultural rhythms. To be clear, this is debated. Different scholars emphasize different layers. And here is the secret. Hiding inside all of it, the underworld is paperwork because life is paperwork. The mythic world mirrors the administrative world. That's not an insult to the ancients. It's a recognition that their greatest invention, organized cities, created a need for rules everywhere. Even the dead have a place in the system. You feel the reed stylus again, even here. Tap, press, lift. Tap, press, lift. In your mind, you see a scribe writing names of the dead, recording offerings, marking dates. The afterlife becomes legible because the living keep writing. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the secret of these underworld tablets is that they reveal how ancient people made peace with uncertainty? They couldn't control floods, they couldn't control sickness, they couldn't control war, but they could build narratives that gave those things a shape, and shape is soothing. A story with gates and rules is less terrifying than a void with no language. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm how widespread these beliefs were among ordinary people. How literally they were held, how they changed across time, how grief sounded in those ancient streets at night. The tablets give you outlines, not full faces. So you let the underworld gate fade. You let the guard's silhouette blur. You let the dust settle. You step back into the living city because that's where the tablets are made, where the reed stylus scratches, where names and numbers and stories are pressed into clay. And you carry the 10th secret forward beneath the myths of the underworld. You can hear the practical heartbeat of a civilization that turned even fate into something you could record, interpret, and carry. You come back up into daylight without any jolt, like a swimmer rising slowly through warm water. The underworld gate dissolves behind you, but the feeling of order sticks to your skin. Gates lists rules. It's all the same mindset. And now, as you return to the living city, you hear the sound that has been quietly running beneath everything tonight. Not thunder, not prophecy, barley. It arrives as a soft rustle as grain pours into a basket. It arrives as a dull thump when a sack hits the ground. It arrives as a steady murmur when people argue about quantities, because somehow the biggest dramas in human history can still come down to, that's not the amount we agreed on. Most historians agree that temple and palace households in Mesopotamia play central roles in managing land labor and goods, especially in certain periods. Archaeology suggests large storage facilities, administrative buildings, and extensive accounting practices tied to institutional power. The evidence we do have points to an economy where redistribution, collecting, storing, and allocating resources matters enormously, even if private trade and household production also exist. And this is where the 11th secret settles in temple economy and the sound of barley. What's broadly accepted is that countless tablets are basically the voice of storage rooms. They record deliveries of grain oil, wool, livestock. They list rations for workers' assignments for labor teams and transfers between officials. Most historians agree that these records aren't just boring paperwork. They are the skeleton of early urban life. Without them, the city doesn't coordinate. With them, the city becomes a machine that can feed specialists, build walls, fund temples, and support elites. One interpretation is that what looks like offerings in some contexts might also function as taxation or obligatory contributions. A careful reading might suggest that sacred language and economic reality overlap, so the god received barley can also mean the institution received barley. That's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that people genuinely believed their offering sustained divine order, and the economic effect was real, but not cynical. Both can be true at once, sincere belief and practical redistribution. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian temples primarily drove economic activity through centralized redistribution, or whether markets and private enterprise were equally significant and sometimes dominant, because the evidence shows both institutional control and independent trade. Scholars continue to debate the balance across time region and social class. There's no full consensus, and tonight you don't need one. You just need to feel the steady rhythm of the system. You walk into a storeroom in your imagination. It's cooler inside, the air thick with dust and the faint sweet smell of grain. Jars line the walls. Baskets sit in rows. A clerk stands near a doorway with a tablet stylus poised. A worker steps forward, unshoulders a sack, and the barley pours out with that soft, dry waterfall sound. It's oddly soothing, like sand in a glass hourglass, like the world counting itself. Most historians agree that rations are a common feature of institutional labor systems. Archaeology suggests ration tablets can include different allocations based on status, age, role, and sometimes gender. The evidence we do have points to a structured distribution system that keeps labor forces functioning. You can imagine it in sleepy detail. A line of workers hands out faces, tired each, receiving a measured portion. Grain, oil, wool, maybe beer if you're lucky, and the overseer is in a good mood. And yes, here's one of your light jokes. You would absolutely be the worker who tries to negotiate for more beer by claiming you're spiritually vital to the project. The overseer would stare at you, then point to the tablet and say, "The clay disagrees." This is the quiet secret inside the barley economy. The tablet doesn't just record reality, it creates it. Once a ration is written, it becomes official. Once a delivery is sealed, it becomes unquestionable in a way spoken words never are. A careful reading might suggest that writing is a tool of control, not only memory. That's an interpretation, not a certainty, but it matches the power of records in any bureaucratic society. Let me rephrase that more carefully. This raises the possibility that the rise of writing and accounting strengthens institutional power by making claims durable and auditable. This is suggestive, not conclusive. But you can feel it as you watch the scribe press wedges, watch the seal roll, watch the clay harden. The city becomes less dependent on personal trust and more dependent on documented procedure. Most historians agree that seals and signatures in Mesopotamia help authenticate transactions. Archaeology suggests administrative systems become increasingly complex over time. The evidence we do have points to specialization: scribes, overseers, accountants, couriers, people whose job is to make sure barley moves from field to storeroom to worker without disappearing into someone's private stash. And that's another gentle human truth. Wherever there's a storeroom, there's also someone thinking about creative accounting. You can picture it. A worker scoops a little extra glances around, smooths the surface. A clerk pretends not to notice. Or maybe notices and writes a stern note that no one reads. Humans have always been humans. Now the misty part handled safely. A fringe idea proposes that temple economies are not just institutions, but secret engines of hidden knowledge, vaults of forbidden tablets, guarded recipes, coded maps suggesting the real purpose of the storeroom is to protect secrets, not grain. This theory isn't widely accepted. Most historians agree that while temples could preserve texts and traditions, their economic function is clearly documented in large bodies of administrative material. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and here the secret vault claim is thin as a sweeping explanation. But you can still enjoy a calmer what if that doesn't mislead. What if some temples do function as libraries, as well as warehouses, storing not just barley, but memory? What if the same corridor that leads to grain jars also leads to shelves of tablets? Not because they're hiding cosmic truths, but because institutions that manage life also manage knowledge. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it fits how many powerful institutions behave. Most historians agree that scribal activity is often connected to temples and palaces, and that archives exist. Archaeology suggests tablets can be stored in administrative buildings, sometimes preserved accidentally through destruction and firing. The evidence we do have points to records kept for practical reasons: audits, disputes, accountability, continuity. Historians still argue whether the very presence of massive archives reflects unusually high levels of centralized control, or simply reflects the preservation bias of what survives, because administrative tablets are more common than the stories that might have been written on perishable materials. Scholars continue to debate how representative surviving archives are of everyday literacy and record-keeping. No full consensus. You step outside the storeroom and the sunlight hits your face. You hear the city again, footsteps, voices, a distant hammering, maybe a donkey complaining like it's being paid to complain. And you realize the barley economy is not only about food, it's about time. Grain is future days stored, oil is future light stored, wool is future warmth stored. The city is basically trying to store tomorrow. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the secret of these barley tablets is that they show civilization as a promise? Work now, eat later. Maintain canals, now harvest later. Record it, now remember later. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm how it felt to stand in that ration line, how gratitude mixed with resentment, how pride mixed with exhaustion. You return to the scribal bench one more time. The reed stylus taps, presses, lifts. Tap, press, lift. The sound is steady, almost hypnotic. It's the sound of a civilization counting itself into existence. And you carry the 11th secret forward, warm and heavy, as a sack of grain beneath the myths and omens, beneath the kings and the gods. The city runs on barley and records on the quiet arithmetic of survival that the tablets preserve in plain sight. You keep moving as if you're being carried gently by the city's own breath. The storeroom smell of barley fades, and the sunlight softens into something later in the day, warmer, slanting, almost sleepy. The reed stylus stays in your mind like a small metronome, because even when the city grows loud, the writing keeps its calm rhythm. Tap, press, lift. Tap, press, lift. And then you hear another sound, metal on metal, not sharp, not cinematic, just practical. A blade being honed, a spearhead being checked, someone testing a strap. It isn't gore, it isn't horror, it's the quiet preparation that comes before conflicts in a world of city-states. Most historians agree that Sumerian city-states and later Mesopotamian polities engage in frequent conflicts, alliances, and negotiations. Archaeology suggests fortifications, weapon finds, destruction layers, and inscriptions that commemorate victories. The evidence we do have points to war as a recurring reality, sometimes small-scale raids, sometimes larger campaigns woven into the politics of waterland and prestige. And here is the 12th secret: war treaties and controlled chaos. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian rulers record victories and claims in inscriptions, sometimes on stelae statues and tablets. These texts often present war as righteous, divinely supported, and inevitable. Most historians agree that this is partly propaganda. It's a public narrative meant to legitimize authority and intimidate rivals. Archaeology suggests the record can be compared across sources and sites, and the evidence we do have points to a mix of reality and rhetorical exaggeration. One interpretation is that heroic language in these texts masks the anxious logistics underneath. A careful reading might suggest that behind the boasts are practical concerns: canal control, field boundaries, access to trade routes, tribute, and labor. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it fits how most conflicts work. A more cautious explanation could be that rulers sincerely believed divine favor was tied to victory, while also being fully aware that victory required organization and supplies. Historians still argue whether specific conflicts described in royal inscriptions reflect the scale and outcomes claimed because rulers have incentives to exaggerate, omit defeats, or frame stalemates as triumphs. Scholars continue to debate how to read these texts alongside archaeological evidence, especially when destruction layers or settlement patterns don't line up neatly with dramatic accounts. There's no full consensus, and that's why careful reading matters. You find yourself near a city wall, watching men haul baskets of earth and clay. Fortifications rise not as heroic monuments, but as practical projects built by tired hands. A scribe stands nearby, recording labor assignments, ration distribution supplies. And you realize something that feels like a secret because it's so modern war has paperwork. Most historians agree that administrative systems support military efforts through provisioning and labor organization. Archaeology suggests large-scale building and canal work require coordinated labor, often under institutional control. The evidence we do have points to an economy that can be redirected toward defense and conflict when needed. The Reed stylus isn't just writing history, it's enabling action. Let me rephrase that more carefully. This might support the idea that the true power of early states is not just weapons, but logistics, food, storage, labor, coordination, transport, record-keeping. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it's a pattern seen across many eras. You can almost hear the modern echo of it. Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk supply lines, except here it's amateurs talk, God's professionals talk barley. And yes, that's a gentle joke, but also not entirely wrong. Now you step into a room where two officials sit facing each other, not with swords, but with tablets. One brings a seal, the other brings witnesses. They speak carefully, they negotiate. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian societies used treaties, boundary agreements, and legal texts to manage disputes, even if violence still happens. Archaeology suggests written agreements and law collections reflect attempts to formalize order. The evidence we do have points to diplomacy existing alongside conflict, because people have always preferred winning without bleeding when possible. Historians still argue whether early treaties and boundary records reflect genuine enforceable agreements or more symbolic declarations of authority, because enforcement depends on power and context. Scholars continue to debate how often these agreements held in practice and how often they were violated as soon as it was convenient. No full consensus. And here comes one of your light jokes. Imagine signing a treaty in clay. You mess up one wedge mark and accidentally agree to deliver 10,000 sheep instead of 10 sheep. The other side smiles politely like, yes, yes, very reasonable. You would immediately request a refund on ancient diplomacy. Now the misty part handled safely. A fringe idea proposes that certain war narratives and treaty texts conceal hidden conflicts, secret wars with unknown enemies, lost factions erased from history, or coded references to battles not recognized by mainstream scholarship. This theory isn't widely accepted. Most historians agree that gaps and silences in the record are more plausibly explained by incomplete preservation, scribal choices, political rewriting, and the normal bias of surviving documents. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and the secret erased war claim is thin without specific strong evidence. But you can still enjoy a careful what if. What if some events really are missing, not because of conspiracy, but because clay breaks, archives burn, and scribes choose what to copy? What if a city's worst defeat is quietly not mentioned, while its proudest victory is carved in stone? That's not fringe. That's human. A careful reading might suggest that the record we have is shaped by pride. Most historians agree that ancient inscriptions often emphasize victories and legitimacy. Archaeology suggests we see a preservation bias toward official narratives and administrative records. The evidence we do have points to a partial archive, not a complete one. So you stand at the wall as evening settles, and you watch a procession of workers carrying supplies, baskets of grain jars of oil, bundles of reeds. The war machine is not roaring, it's shuffling, it's organized, it's tired. And in the corner, a scribe writes it down. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the secret of Mesopotamian war tablets is that they show early states learning to control chaos, not eliminating it, but containing it with rules, treaties, records, and rituals? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. How often diplomacy prevented bloodshed, how often fear drove decisions, how often ordinary people bore the cost while kings claimed glory. You feel the reed stylus again, steady as always. Tap, press, lift. Tap, press, lift. Even war becomes a column of numbers. Even conflict becomes a list. And that's both unsettling and strangely soothing, because it means the ancient world is not pure violence or pure myth. It's paperwork trying to keep a lid on human impulses. So you carry the 12th secret forward beneath the heroic language and divine claims war. In Sumer is often about canals, grain labor, and legitimacy, about controlled chaos, managed through the same clay records that keep the city fed. You keep moving forward, and the city walls fall behind you like a thought you don't need to hold anymore. Evening thickens. The light turns honey-colored, then fades toward blue, and the sounds of work soften into the quieter sounds of people existing. Small conversations, distant laughter, a pot clinking a reed mat being shaken out. The reed stylus is still your steady companion, but now the wedges it makes begin to feel less like accounts and more like story. Because sooner or later every civilization starts telling itself who it is. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian literature includes myths, hymns, epics, and ritual texts that help communities explain order, legitimacy, and identity. Archaeology suggests these texts are copied and preserved through scribal training and institutional archives. The evidence we do have points to a rich storytelling world where gods, kings, and strange beings populate narratives that are not simply made up but culturally meaningful. And here is the 13th secret: strange beings, watchers, and careful wording. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian and broader Mesopotamian texts contain supernatural figures, divine attendants, monsters, hybrid guardians, and beings whose names and roles shift across languages and time. Most historians agree these figures function symbolically within mythic storytelling, reflecting fears, boundaries, and cultural imagination. Archaeology suggests iconography on seals reliefs and statues often features hybrid creatures, serving as protective motifs or mythic references. The evidence we do have points to a worldview where the supernatural is a language for meaning, not necessarily a literal census of non-human residents. One interpretation is that watchers, or watchful beings in certain traditions, might symbolize elites, outsiders, or priestly observers, human roles recast into mythic form. A careful reading might suggest that stories about beings who see and judge reflect social surveillance and moral expectations. That's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that such figures simply arise from the creative blending of human and animal traits, a way to embody concepts like protection, danger, or liminality. Historians still argue whether specific supernatural figures in Mesopotamian literature represent inherited ancient motifs, later innovations, or cross-cultural borrowings because stories travel and mutate. Scholars continue to debate how much these beings reflect local religion versus broader Near Eastern mythological exchange. There's no full consensus, and that's exactly why the wording must stay careful tonight. You walk into a room where a storyteller speaks softly, almost like a chant. A small group listens. An oil lamp flickers. Shadows on the wall make the story feel alive. The reed stylus appears again as a copying tool somewhere a scribe is taking this living story and pressing it into clay, turning breath into wedges. Most historians agree that myths were performed and then written down, and that the written versions we have reflect scribal choices. Archaeology suggests that what survives is shaped by what institutions valued enough to preserve. The evidence we do have points to a gap between oral performance and written text, and that gap is where interpretation lives. Now, you meet the tempting mist beings described as watchers, guardians, or strange visitors can feel like more than metaphor to modern readers. A fringe idea proposes that these figures are literal records of non-human visitors, ancient astronauts, interdimensional entities, or advanced outsiders remembered as gods and watchers. This theory isn't widely accepted. Most historians agree that mythic figures are best understood through cultural context symbolism and literary tradition. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And in the literal visitor interpretation, it's thin. But we can still sit with the cinematic what-if mood without turning it into a conclusion, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. We can ask what makes a story feel like a record. Sometimes it's specificity. Sometimes it's repeated motifs. Sometimes it's the emotional intensity of the telling. Humans remember the strange and the terrifying. They also exaggerate it. A careful reading might suggest that vivid imagery can arise from real experiences, storms, disease, warfare, unfamiliar strangers filtered through symbolic storytelling. That's an interpretation, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. This might support the idea that myth preserves social memory, but not in a straightforward journalistic way. It preserves how events felt. It preserves anxieties and hopes. It preserves the moral framing. This is suggestive, not conclusive. You think about the word watcher itself, someone who sees someone who keeps an eye on boundaries. In a city-state world, boundaries are everything. Field lines, canal rights, social status, purity rules, temple access. It's possible that guardian figures in art and myth are ways of making boundaries visible. Put a scary hybrid creature at a doorway and suddenly everyone respects the doorway. It's the ancient version of putting a no trespassing sign, except with more claws. And yes, here's one of your light jokes. If someone put a winged bull man at your apartment door, you would definitely stop leaving your shoes in the hallway. Nothing motivates tidiness like supernatural judgment. Most historians agree that protective figures like Lamassu in later Mesopotamian contexts function as guardians, though Sumerian-era equivalents and motifs vary. Archaeology suggests protective iconography is tied to beliefs about warding off harm. The evidence we do have points to a lived sense of vulnerability, disease, famine, invasion, and the daily unknown. Historians still argue whether protective beings in texts and imagery are primarily theological constructs, psychological tools, or cultural aesthetics, because they can be all three. Scholars continue to debate how these motifs shift between periods and empires, and what that says about changing anxieties. Again, no full consensus. Now you notice the careful wording of the scribes, how they frame things. Sometimes a text says, "it is said," or uses formulas that signal tradition. Sometimes the tablet copies a myth in a standardized way, implying a known canon. A careful reading might suggest that, even in ancient times, scribes distinguish between what is recited, what is believed, and what is performed. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it reminds you to treat mystery responsibly, not as proof, but as atmosphere. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the watchers are not visitors from the sky, but the feeling of being watched in a society where gods, kings, and institutions claim oversight? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, how ordinary people internalized these stories. Whether they feared the watchers, respected them, joked about them, or used them to scare children into behaving. Honestly, you can picture it. Go to sleep, or the doorway guardian will hear you. Ancient parenting timeless. You step outside the storyteller's room into the cool night air. The sky is deep. The city is quieting. Somewhere a scribe finishes a line and sets a tablet aside to dry. The story is now clay. It will outlast the voice. And you carry the 13th secret. Forward, the strange beings. In Sumerian tablets are best held with two hands, one on solid ground, seeing them as symbolic language shaped by culture, and one in gentle mist, letting the what-if mood breathe, without pretending it's confirmed. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are calm imagination. The reed stylus taps again, slower now, like it's ready to lull you. Tap, press, lift, and you walk onward, leaving the watchers behind you, not solved, not dismissed, just quietly acknowledged as part of the ancient human habit of turning fear and wonder into story. You keep walking, and the city feels like it's settling into itself, like a house getting quiet after everyone finally goes to bed. The storyteller's room fades behind you. The guardians and watchers fade too, leaving only the night air and the soft weight of time. The reed stylus is still there, tapping faintly, but now your attention shifts towards something that isn't written, or rather, something that should have been written but isn't. You find yourself in a place where broken tablets lie in baskets, where fragments are stacked like chipped pieces of a puzzle no one can fully rebuild. A scribe turns one piece over, squints at it, and sighs. A missing corner, a missing line, a missing word that would have made the whole thing make sense. Most historians agree that what survives of Mesopotamian writing is only a fraction of what once existed. Archaeology suggests countless tablets were lost to erosion, looting, reuse, and the simple decay of time, and many surviving tablets are broken. The evidence we do have points to enormous gaps in the record, not because someone always tried to hide things, but because clay is durable and fragile at the same time. And here is the 14th secret: lost instructions, missing lines, and deliberate silence. What's broadly accepted is that a broken tablet can change everything. When a text is incomplete, you can often understand the general topic, but miss the crucial twist. You might know it's a legal case, but not the verdict. You might know it's a hymn, but not the final plea. You might know it's a treaty, but not the boundary description. Most historians agree that reconstructing meaning from fragments requires cautious comparison across copies and contexts, and even then, uncertainty remains. One interpretation is that some omissions might be accidental breakage wear or scribal error. A careful reading might suggest that many mysteries are simply the consequence of missing data. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it's the mainstream starting point. A more cautious explanation could be that the secret is preservation bias. We have what was stored in certain buildings, in certain cities, in certain periods, and not what was written on perishable materials or kept in places that didn't survive. Historians still argue whether apparent gaps in certain narratives reflect accidental loss or reflect intentional selection, what scribes chose to copy, what institutions valued, and what rulers wanted remembered. Scholars continue to debate how much ancient archives represent everyday life versus official priorities. There's no full consensus because absence is hard to interpret. You hold a tablet fragment in your imagination. It's cool and gritty. The broken edge looks like a coastline. You can see wedge marks cut off mid-sign like a sentence interrupted. Your mind wants to complete it the way your brain completes a melody when it hears only half the notes. This is where the mist creeps in the urge to fill gaps with certainty. But we're not doing that tonight. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Still, the possibility of deliberate silence is real enough to consider carefully. Most historians agree that official inscriptions often emphasize victories and legitimacy, and that rulers have incentives to omit failures. Archaeology suggests that what gets preserved can reflect power dynamics and institutional choices. The evidence we do have points to a world where writing is not neutral. It is a tool. One interpretation is that some texts were selectively copied to maintain a certain narrative. A careful reading might suggest that archives are curated, even if unintentionally. That's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that scribes preserved what they needed for practical reasons, legal precedents, administrative templates, training texts, and sometimes the practical just wins over the dramatic. Historians still argue whether certain shifts in textual tradition, what genres dominate, what themes fade, reflect changes in society's interests or changes in what survived by chance. Scholars continue to debate how often we should interpret silence as intention versus accident. No full consensus. Now the misty part handled safely. A fringe idea proposes that missing lines and broken passages are not random at all, but evidence of censorship designed to hide forbidden knowledge, advanced technology, secret histories, or uncomfortable truths. This theory isn't widely accepted. Most historians agree that breakage and loss explain most gaps, and that sensational claims require specific, strong evidence. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and here it's thin as a blanket explanation. But you can still entertain a gentler what if without jumping to conclusions. What if in some cases silence is simply a form of power choosing not to write something down, or choosing not to copy it because it doesn't serve the institution? Not a conspiracy with hooded priests, just the ordinary human habit of preserving what supports you. That's an interpretation, not a certainty, and it's plausible because we still do it. We all have our own internal archive policy, and it usually favors our best moments. Let me rephrase that more carefully. This might support the idea that the historical record is shaped not only by what happened, but by what people chose to record and preserve. This is suggestive, not conclusive. You walk through a room where shelves hold tablets. Some are neatly stacked, some are toppled, some are missing. You imagine a fire long ago, a collapse, a flood, and the sudden chaos that turns an archive into a scatter of fragments. Archaeology suggests many tablets survive because of accidental firing during destruction events, which preserves them, but also often breaks them. The evidence we do have points to catastrophe as both preserver and destroyer, which is a strange, sleepy irony. And here comes one of your light jokes, because you need a breath. Imagine being a scribe who spent a year copying a masterpiece only for the tablet to break exactly at the most important word. Future scholars stare at it like we can almost read it. Meanwhile, ancient you is in the afterlife, somewhere yelling. It said, barley, not betrayal. You're overthinking it. Most historians agree that modern reconstruction work relies on comparing multiple copies using context and cautious inference. Archaeology suggests many texts exist in multiple versions, which can help fill gaps. The evidence we do have points to impressive scholarly effort, but also to limits. Sometimes the missing line is simply missing. Historians still argue whether certain famous broken passages should be restored one way or another because different reconstructions can shift meaning. Scholars continue to debate best practices for restoration and interpretation, especially for poetic or mythic texts, where a single sign can change tone. Again, no full consensus. Now you feel the secret settle into its real shape. It isn't just about lost words, it's about humility. The tablets remind you that history is not a perfect recording, it's a partial echo. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The missing pieces force the historian's voice to soften, might make good suggests. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the most honest mystery in Sumerian tablets is not what's written, but what's gone? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You can read a ration list and still not know the worker's thoughts. You can read a victory inscription and still not know the fear behind it. You can read a hymn and still not know who sang it first and why. And yet, the broken clay still speaks. You hold the fragment gently. You imagine the reed stylus that made those marks. You hear the tap again, faint like a lullaby from a distant room. Tap, press, lift. Tap, press, lift. You set the fragment back in its basket, and you carry the 14th secret forward in ancient archives. Absence is a kind of presence. Missing lines shape what we can say. They demand care. They invite curiosity without certainty. They keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and they remind you in the softest way that not knowing is part of the story. You keep moving forward, as if the city itself is easing you toward rest. The basket of fragments is behind you now, but the feeling lingers, the sense that history is partly what's written and partly what's missing. The reed stylus, your tiny companion all night, taps more slowly now, like it's getting sleepy too. Tap, press, lift. Tap, press, lift. The sound becomes softer, almost like rain on a window. Most historians agree that Sumerian tablets give us one of the earliest detailed windows into urban life, work worship, conflict, family law, and story. Archaeology suggests the secrets in these tablets are rarely single hidden messages, and more often patterns that emerge when you read thousands of lines. The evidence we do have points to a world both familiar and alien, familiar in its bureaucracy, trade, and social pressure, alien in its gods, symbols, and the way it ties meaning to everything. And this is where the final gathering happens, the 15th section, where you collect the 10 secrets, not as separate trophies, but as a single sleep-friendly thread. Because the deepest secret of all might be that Sumerian tablets don't just tell you facts. They train you in a way of seeing. Most historians agree that early writing starts practical and grows outward into law, literature, wisdom, and memory. Archaeology suggests the scribal tradition becomes a backbone of institutions carrying knowledge across generations. The evidence we do have points to a human achievement that is almost too quiet to appreciate: a reed stylus touching clay and turning time into something you can hold. One interpretation is that the phrase 10 ancient secrets hidden in tablets is less about hidden codes and more about hidden angles. A careful reading might suggest that each secret is a different lens: administration time, disaster, memory, sky observation, institutional theology, measurement, identity, coping systems, care, practices, and moral storytelling. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it fits everything you've walked through tonight. A more cautious explanation could be that we're simply organizing themes that scholars already discuss and calling them secrets because the patterns feel like discoveries when you notice them. Historians still argue whether the greatest value of cuneiform archives is the high-level political history they can reconstruct or the everyday social history they reveal, because both are present and priorities differ by scholar and by available evidence. There's no full consensus, and that's part of the beauty. The tablets can be read many ways, and responsible reading keeps the solid ground separate from the mist. So you slow your pace and look back, not to restart anything, but to let the threads settle in your hands. The first secret is the clay dawn itself. What's broadly accepted is that early writing often begins as accounting and administration, and the evidence we do have points to cities learning to remember at scale. One interpretation is that this boring paperwork is actually the foundation of everything: later myth, law, science, empire, because without records, complexity collapses. What if the wet clay under your fingers is the first quiet heartbeat of civilization? The second secret is time stitched into legitimacy. Most historians agree king lists mix symbolic and historical elements, and archaeology suggests political memory is shaped by institutions. One interpretation is that long reigns and clean successions are ideological smoothing. And what if the timeline itself is a crafted story meant to make the world feel stable? The third secret is the flood that won't stay put. What's broadly accepted is that floods happen and flood stories spread. And the evidence we do have points to multiple local disasters that could become one iconic narrative. One interpretation is that memory and myth blend. And what if the story is pointing at a disaster so overwhelming for someone that it became everyone's flood? The fourth secret is the sky as an archive. Most historians agree Mesopotamian scholars watch the heavens carefully, and archaeology suggests systematic records of cycles and events. One interpretation is that omens sometimes rest on real observation. And what if what looks like prophecy is partly data collected with patience you can almost feel? The fifth secret is gods as administration. What's broadly accepted is that temples are powerful institutions, and the evidence we do have points to religion and economy braided together. One interpretation is that divine language can function as institutional language. And what if the gods are also the paperwork, the sacred wrapper around governance? The sixth secret is measurement. Most historians agree standardized weights and sexagesimal math support city life, and archaeology suggests impressive calculation traditions. One interpretation is that numbers become sacred because they become powerful. And what if the city itself is built on quiet arithmetic and shared standards? The seventh secret is names. What's broadly accepted is that tablets preserve many individuals, and the evidence we do have points to social networks embedded in lists. One interpretation is that names are threads through institutions. And what if a repeated name is the closest thing you'll ever get to following an ordinary life across millennia? The eighth secret is the science of worry. Most historians agree Omen and dream traditions are structured and extensive, and archaeology suggests institutions preserve them carefully. One interpretation is that divination is also coping and risk management. And what if the real magic is how humans organize uncertainty so they can keep living? The ninth secret is care. What's broadly accepted is that medical texts blend remedy and ritual, and the evidence we do have points to observation and tradition working together. One interpretation is that incantations can be comfort alongside treatment, and what if the most human thing in the archive is the stubborn desire to soothe pain? The 10th secret is moral paperwork. In the underworld, most historians agree, underworld myths are symbolic maps of meaning, and archaeology suggests beliefs and practices vary. One interpretation is that afterlife stories mirror social order, and what if the gates and rules are really about teaching the living how to carry vulnerability with dignity? Those 10 secrets sit together now, not as a puzzle you must solve, but as a calm collection of lenses. And now you feel the last 5 sections' themes fold in too, like a blanket you pull up without thinking. The temple economy of barley reminds you that civilization is storage and redistribution tomorrow packed into jars. War and treaties remind you that order is never permanent. It's maintained, negotiated, repaired, and sometimes rewritten. The Watchers and strange beings remind you that story is a tool for boundaries, fear, wonder, and identity. And the broken fragments remind you that humility is part of scholarship, because the archive is always incomplete. Historians still argue whether our modern fascination with secrets sometimes says more about us than about the ancients. Because we love mysteries, we love hidden rooms, we love the idea that a single revelation will rearrange everything. Scholars continue to debate how best to communicate uncertainty without draining wonder. There's no full consensus, but tonight you've practiced the balance, solid ground, and mist. Now a final misty note, carefully framed. A fringe idea proposes that the tablets conceal a single, hidden narrative beneath all the genres, an encoded account of lost ages, outsiders, or forbidden technologies. This theory isn't widely accepted. Most historians agree that the tablets are diverse records created for diverse purposes, and that broad, one hidden truth claims usually oversimplify the evidence. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and here it's thin. But you can still let a gentle what-if hover without turning it into a conclusion. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not aliens or secret doomsday schedules, but the fact that human beings have always tried to tame a big, unpredictable world by writing it down, measuring it, naming it, narrating it, and ritualizing it. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm how it felt to live inside those systems, how much people believed, how much they doubted, how often they laughed to keep going. And you can almost hear them laugh, actually, if you listen softly. A worker joking in line, a scribe teasing an apprentice, a priest making a tired remark about offerings, a mother telling a child not to provoke the doorway guardian. It's all there, faintly like footsteps in dust. Now the pacing slows and the vocabulary softens, and you let the last images become gentle. The reed stylus taps one last time, then pauses as if it's being set down on a wooden bench. The clay tablet sits drying in the corner of a room. Outside, the river moves without hurry. Above, the stars keep their quiet turning. The city breathes. The archive waits. You don't need to solve the ancient world to rest inside it. You can let it be layered. You can let it be partially known. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You can let the solid ground hold you while the mist makes the edges beautiful. You feel the night settle deeper now, like a soft blanket that knows exactly how heavy to be. In your mind, the city of clay and reeds grows quieter, not because it disappears, but because your attention is loosening its grip. The storerooms close. The temple lamps dim. The last scribe stops pressing wedges and flexes his aching fingers, and the reed stylus rests at last, a simple tool that did an extraordinary thing. The river keeps moving. It always will. Sometimes gentle, sometimes wild. But tonight, it's only a low whisper beside the banks. The air cools in small steps. Somewhere far away, a dog barks once and then remembers it's tired too. The stars look steady and patient, like they've watched 1,000 worries rise and fall, and still never felt the need to rush anyone. If your mind tries to chase one more answer, you let it slow down and soften. You remind yourself that the ancient secrets we followed are not riddles you must solve. They're quiet clues that invite you to wonder, and wonder is allowed to be unfinished. You can let the questions sit on a shelf, like tablets, drying in the dark, safe, waiting, not demanding anything from you right now. So you breathe in slow and easy. You breathe out longer. The clay room fades. The river sound becomes the fan hum again. The reed stylus becomes a distant tapping that finally stops. And the night, calm and ordinary and kind, gives you permission to drift.